Oh, great. I can see that there are many of you rolling on in. Welcome and hello. Thank you for joining us this afternoon as I can see these numbers growing. And while we're waiting for everyone else to join, would you mind taking a moment to introduce yourselves over on Padlet? The instructions are on the screen there. If you have a phone or an iPad or another device, you can scan the QR code. Otherwise, we will drop a link into the chat now and you can copy that across and open it in a browser. All right. Let me just drop that link into the chat. Okay, hopefully some of you are across on the Padlet. I can see some of you starting to go there, including Sandy. Thank you for kicking us off. While you're introducing yourself over there, I will get started on today's session because we have a few things packed in. And I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm joining you here today from Wurundjeri lands and I particularly acknowledge their elders past and present. If you're not over on the Padlet or when you have a moment, I'd encourage you to share what traditional land you are joining us from in the chat box. At EFRL, we also accept the invitation in the Uluru Statement from the Heart to walk together with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. We'll share a link in the chat to some more information about the Uluru Statement from the Heart, including a toolkit for educators, which you may like to have a look at. And looking across on my Padlet, I can see that many of you are introducing yourselves. Hello and welcome. So we're here today to talk about supporting behaviour in early childhood education and care settings. My name is Hannah Matthews and I'm an Associate Director at Evidence for Learning. My background is in teaching. I'm formerly a primary school teacher and I've also worked in education policy and research spaces throughout my career. I'm really pleased to be joined by Dr. Sally Staten and Dr. Sandy Hewen, and I will hand over to them to introduce themselves. Over to you, Sally.
Hi, everyone. Lovely to see you all this afternoon. So I'm Dr. Sally Staten. I work at the University of Queensland and the Queensland Brain Institute. My background is as a developmental psychologist, so developmental psychology, and I've done many years of research in early childhood education and care, and really have a strong passion for how we translate evidence into practice for those working in the sector.
Hi everyone, and I'm really sorry my dog has just started barking, so I'm really sorry about that. My name's Dr. Sandy Cowan and I am a past early childhood teacher, and I moved into academia because I wanted to make a difference to children's lives and also in a really practical way. So I was really interested in doing a PhD that focused on practitioner strategies to support children's interactions. And so I'm in the very fortunate position to be now working with Sally at Queensland Brain Institute at UQ to focus on translation of resources. So I feel very privileged in my role.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Sally. It's a pleasure to have you here with us this afternoon. I might just spend a few minutes introducing you to Evidence for Learning as well, in case you haven't come across us before or if you're not familiar with our resources. Evidence for Learning is an independent not-for-profit and we work across the early years and in schools in all states, all territories and all sectors. We were founded in 2015 and we operate as part of Social Ventures Australia. And our specialisation is really in translating evidence that can then help and then helping to kind of implement it in education settings. So educators, those of you that are working with children and young people, are really at the centre of what we do. Thanks, Sandy. So you might see that reflected in our mission on the screen there. Our evidence guides and all of our resources are available for free on our website. Oh, I did skip a slide, sorry. All of our evidence is available for free on our website, and we have some resources specific to what we're talking about today, which we will drop a link in the chat to at the end of our session, so you can access all of those. When it comes to evidence, essentially our philosophy is about evidence-informed practice, and how we approach our work is really considering it within the context of professional judgment and decision-making. So the quote that you can see on the screen here is from Professor Jonathan Sharples, and it encapsulates it quite nicely. So evidence-informed decisions are about integrating professional expertise with the best external evidence from research to improve the quality of practice. And when we're talking about this, he goes on to make the point that it's not about prescribing what goes on from a position of unchallenged authority. So really singing to your professional expertise in how you incorporate evidence into your practice. When we are talking about evidence, I suppose that it's quite important to note that not all evidence is equal. There are examples of more robust evidence and less robust evidence. This pyramid that you can see on the slide here shows that how different kinds of evidence can be critically assessed. So starting at your base at level 4, where you might have things like personal experience and anecdotes, and then moving through to case studies with defined measures and results at level 3, up to experimental studies, testing for causation at level 2, and finally at the top there at level 1, to repeatable findings from multiple studies. We know that the best innovations, though, begin with limited evidence of impact, and they then go through the process of being supported and validated or discounted over time with increasing degrees of rigour and confidence. We also acknowledge that the most robust evidence may not be precise enough for you to use in your day-to-day practice, and so this is again where your professional discretion comes into play. The research that we'll be talking about today, that you'll hear Sally go into a little bit more detail about, is a systematic review. And a systematic review includes summarising all of the research that's on a particular topic that meets predefined eligibility criteria in order to answer a specific research question, which is what the team at UQ have done. And it's a really great example of unbiased, robust research. In terms of why we're focusing on responding to challenging behaviours in early childhood education and care, well, we know that it's an area of practice that educators are seeking support for. So some research that was led recently by Professor Karen Thorpe from the University of Queensland and colleagues including Sandy and Sally analysed national survey data from 794 early childhood educators, and they found that challenging behaviours were impacting their workplace wellbeing and educational effectiveness, and that it was something that they were seeking more support for. So in a nutshell, that's why we've developed these resources on responding to challenging behaviour in early childhood education and care. And it's also why we're here with you this evening to provide a little bit more information and context around them. So for the rest of our session, we'll be hearing from you about behaviours that challenge in your context before moving on to defining and discussing why we respond to behaviours that challenge. And we'll then look at evidence-informed strategies and have a few minutes for questions at the end. I'll very quickly walk you through the aims of our session today as well, because I think I skipped over them before. Essentially, our aims for today's session are for you to know why we've published these resources, for you to know why we've identified the evidence and what it said, and also to provide you with some evidence-informed strategies that you can use in situations that challenge within your own context. All right, without further ado, I am going to hand over to Sally.
Thanks, Hannah. So the first thing we're actually going to do is pass over to all of you, because we thought you could do some work today too at this time in the afternoon. That's nice of us, isn't it? And really it's to use the Padlet, if you have had a chance to log in, to really share some of the types of behaviours that you are finding to be challenging in the work that you do. And really what we're looking for here is to focus on things that we would consider low and mid-level behaviours that you find challenging. And the reason we want to identify this and focus on this is because this is the types of behaviours that we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to come back to some of the things we won't be talking about in a moment. So if people could share there. Sandy, I don't have my Padlet open, I've just realised, so I might need you to jump in and share what you're seeing, please. Please make sure you put in the chat if you're having any issues that we can help you with in terms of the Padlet too. We will be using it a couple of times in today's session.
Some of the things that are popping up, Sally, are aggression, swearing, hitting, emotional regulation, frustration that leads to aggression. Sorry, they're moving very quickly. There's a lot of brainstorming happening here, which is great to see. Children being disrespectful, laughing when they've been spoken to about their behaviours, hitting and throwing toys, stress response behaviours, physical aggression towards educators, emotional regulation, disconnection, frustration.
Beautiful. Thank you, Hannah. I think that's a really diverse mix. And I think that leads us beautifully to, I guess, thinking about what do we mean by challenging behaviours. So, Sandy, if you want to pop to that next slide for us. Not going through. There we go. Beautiful. Thank you. So when we're talking about challenging behaviours, what we've defined this as is that behaviours reflect a misalignment between behaviours that are expected and those that are observed. And you can see why we've had to use a very broad description, because the range of challenges that we might be facing in an ECE's environment are extensive. There's all sorts of things. But of course, what we see as challenging is going to depend on our own experiences, the particular context, the expectations we have in the environment, and our expectations for particular children. So different children we expect to act in different ways, sometimes due to perhaps the age of the child or other kinds of disabilities or difficulties the child might be having. In terms of, just the next slide there, in terms of why we care about challenging behaviour, there's three key reasons. The first is that we know that challenging behaviours for children, all sorts of different types of behaviours, have long-term impacts on children. So they influence the children's ability to engage with learning in the short term, and also behaviours appear in terms of building social relationships. But over time, the wealth of research over many years has shown that it also can have impacts for children long term. And so early childhood education and care is a really important point at which we can provide supports to children to help guide them towards making good decisions about behaviour, and also managing their behaviour in a range of social contexts throughout their lifespan. It also affects the peers in the classroom. So, of course, it's not just about the individual child, but also about what impact it might be having on the learning and engagement and relationships of other children in a room. And of course, and I think equally importantly, it also affects the educators in the room. So educators themselves, as you can see from that study that was raised by Hannah in a few slides past, also are impacted by the behaviours in the classroom in terms of their ability to do their work, and also in terms of the stress that might be causing to an educator. So it's really important that we have strategies to support that. Now, in terms of behaviours, there are, as I said, diverse behaviours, but we can broadly group these into three key types. And this is what we find in the literature, which is externalising. So they're the really outward focused. And interestingly, in people's responses, but not surprisingly, externalising tends to be the ones we focus on the most. So these include our things such as conduct issues, so the misbehaving, perhaps the swearing, those sorts of outward behaviours. And also inattention behaviours, not attending to the work that we're wanting them to do, or having conversations where the child isn't attending to what we're saying. The flip side of that are internalising, and again, not surprisingly, but I think importantly, these are issues that tend to actually be less of a focus, both in the research, but sometimes in the classroom too, because they're less disruptive, but they're equally important. So these might be issues such as children having difficulties engaging with peers, so building relationships, building friendships or initiating interactions with their peers and others, and also children that might have emotional difficulties, so might have anxiety, have a particular emotional responses to certain situations that we feel are outside their expectation there. These are really important to recognise, because whilst we perhaps are less directly affected by them in the short term, for these children, they're often the children that need a lot of support across time and can have some really poor adverse outcomes if we don't provide support for these children and recognise the struggles they might be having. The third group, which is important to mention because it does come into the research we're sharing today, is also pro-social behaviours. Now, these are not the problem behaviours, but often seen as the converse of that. And so that's the building the kinds of behaviours we want to see, such as, for example, sharing, being considerate to our peers, taking turns, all of those sorts of things. And so some of the research that we will be reviewing today is not so much about stopping challenging behaviour, but encouraging those pro-social behaviours that we want to see. So the systematic review that we ran, just very briefly, is focused essentially on this question: what is the current evidence for educators implementing strategies to respond to challenging behaviours in ECEC? As I've said, we were focused on common low to mid-level behaviours. We very specifically excluded studies of children with specific diagnosis or learning difficulties. And that was important because I think each of those probably warrant their own systematic review in and of themselves, because there are a range of very specific techniques that would be suitable for children who may have received a diagnosis. In saying that, there will be children within this sample, simply because of the age of the child, who may not have a diagnosis but may have gone on to it. Those children are still included in the reviews that we undertook. The other criteria that we had is that they needed to be implemented by the educator. So these are not strategies of someone coming in who's perhaps a therapist or a psychologist coming into the classroom, but specifically those that have evidence of an educator being able to use them as part of their daily practice, very specifically located in early childhood education and care settings and for children aged 2 to 5 years. The final thing to say is that we were focused specifically on strategies that stood alone. So there are an awful lot of programs out there for dealing with challenging behaviours. We are not reviewing programs today. We have other work. We have reviewed programs, but this was really coming down to specific strategies that educators could use in the classroom for which there's an evidence base. Now, in order to do this, it was a big task. So we did our searches and we had over 5,000 articles that we needed to sift through. We had 528 articles that we read the entire article to see that it fit the criteria or not. And in the end, there were only 34 papers across the international literature all over the world that could specifically provide evidence of strategies for early childhood education care. Now, the nice thing is there were lots of strategies that were looked at, and so we've got plenty to share with you today. But it's important to remember that there are likely to be a range of strategies that won't have been covered or looked at, and that doesn't mean those strategies aren't useful, but that we just don't know whether they work or not at this point in time. So I'm going to pass over to Sandy, and she's going to take you through the findings.
So I think I actually get the fun bit to actually talk about the evidence that we found. First of all, it was really great to understand how we gathered the evidence and to provide you some context of what was included and what was excluded. So now the 34 papers that were included, we then systematically analysed to identify the strategies within each paper. And those strategies were then categorised into 3 main categories, and these relate to the timing of a response. So setting the scene, in the moment, and resetting the scene were the 3 categories that we identified. So setting the scene actually occurs before a behaviour happens. So this is about being proactive to plan for and prevent behaviours that may challenge. In the moment focuses on strategies relating to how educators respond to challenging behaviours as they occur. So, for example, two children arguing in the classroom, arguing over a resource or having trouble taking turns, etc. Resetting the scene, although was less common in the literature, relates to an educator's action in the follow-up on the challenging behaviours that have occurred or are typically reoccurring behaviours. So we'll now discuss each of the categories and provide some specific strategies for you. So we'll start with setting the scene. So the strategies identified really relate to developing positive relationships and stable environments for children that can enable them to develop and practice the knowledge and skills that they'll need, not only in the early childhood environment, but throughout their life. So 4 strategies were identified in the literature, and these were developing positive relationships, providing stable foundations, empowering and enabling children to feel knowledgeable and have the skills to make some decisions themselves, and also clearly communicating your own expectations. So the bond between children and educators can act as a protective factor. So these bonds can help to prevent or de-escalate challenging behaviours, and strategies that focus on strengthening educator-child relationships have been shown to be really reliable in terms of influencing the quality of interactions, and also may influence child behaviours as well. So banking time was a specific strategy that was identified from quite a few studies actually out of the 34, and banking time showed potential to increase task orientation and also children's tolerance of frustration, and also reduce conduct problems. I do need to point out that 2 studies did find that banking time did not reduce conduct problems, however, still increased task orientation and children's tolerance to frustration. So how do you do banking time? Banking time involves repeated, and this is typically daily, short sessions of 5 to 15 minutes duration in which an educator interacts one-to-one with the child who is exhibiting behaviours that challenge. So importantly, this banking time is done outside the moment that challenges. So it's important that the child selects the activity, the child leads the play, and educators are asked to observe what the child's doing, to label and narrate the child-led actions. Also, they're asked to limit questions, they're asked to limit commands, and also asked to limit praise during banking time. So it was found that banking time was more effective when these steps were followed carefully and not modified in any way. I must point out, though, banking time is not the time to have a conversation with the child about the behaviour that you're finding challenging. This is more about developing that quality relationship with the child. So it's all about that positive relationship, with the view that positive relationships can influence children's behaviour. Providing stable foundations was another strategy, and this can be nurtured through consistency of educators and really stable emotional foundations and emotional environments. So I realise having the same staff at all times is difficult, if not impossible, due to operational constraints, for example, staff rostering, but it is important, however, to consider ways to promote the stable environments for both staff and children. So one strategy that I have used during my teaching days, when I job shared with another teacher, was to provide a visual display of the staff roster. So although this specific strategy is not evidence-based, I'm going to say it sort of aligns with the evidence. So here's an example of the type of roster. Now, a lot of you probably use this up on the parent notice board on a daily basis. I guess the way I implemented it, this was actually displayed at the children's height, and we often referred to the roster to inform children who was going to be with them. So if you had, split shifts, etc., you could have 2 teachers or 2 educators' photos on the same day. So stable environments are also really significant for, again, as Sally mentioned, both educators and children, because educator work environments are children's learning environments. If educators are stressed, there's increasing research evidence that the quality of interactions is compromised. So for children, stable environments also enable them to predict what's going on or going to happen, and expectations can be a little bit more consistent. It also enables children to feel secure. So there are some questions up on the screen. So I just want you to check in with your own emotional environment. So take a minute to think about your classroom context at the moment, or your centre context for directors or educational leaders, and consider whether is this emotional environment stable? Is it predictable? Does it change? When does it change? And how are you feeling in terms of the emotional environment? And can you check in with children, or do you know how the children are feeling? So I want you to think about, is there anything that you could do tomorrow to take a step to stabilising the emotional environment for children? And for yourselves, actually, by the way. So from the review, we also identified 4 strategies that can help children increase positive behaviours. So that's the pro-social behaviours Sally mentioned earlier. So sharing, empathy, helping and comforting others. And also on the flip side, to decrease the negative ones, such as non-compliance, grabbing toys or peers, and physical or verbal outbursts. So these strategies can help to equip children with knowledge and skills that help them to better deal with challenging behaviours. So the first strategy is what's called video stimulated conversations. And these use videos or photographs of children engaging in positive behaviours. So educators use these visual prompts to talk with a child about what the children are doing. So Sally also mentioned earlier that there's deep concern about the internalising behaviours in the long term, and with limited research on the topic. This was one of the few strategies that was identified to support children who are having difficulties initiating peer interactions. So that may help to alleviate some of the internalising behaviours that you may experience in the classroom. Story prompted conversations. Use children's books or stories, and I'm sure you do this naturally, as the stimulus for discussing characters' feelings, their needs, and pro-social actions. So, for example, one of my favourite books by Julia Donaldson is The Smartest Giant in Town. And for those of you who don't know it, George is a giant who has just gone to the shops to buy brand new clothes, new shoes, a scarf, a hat, etc. On his way home, he meets various animals in states of distress. A giraffe, for example, who has a very cold neck. So George progressively gives away each piece of clothing to these animals in distress, and he ends up having no clothes and feels a little bit sad about it. So, cut a very long story short, he ends up finding his old clothes, and all of the animals that he helped along the way end up giving him a card and a present. And in the card was named him as the kindest giant in town. So here you could possibly talk about the feelings of the animals in distress, but also George giving everything away as well. So there's some really nice opportunities to have conversations with children about how animals are feeling or their needs, and to encourage those pro-social actions. Another strategy that hasn't come up in the evidence, but I think is, again, evidence line, is what is called a persona doll. So I used to use Charlie, who was a life-sized puppet, who was an active member of the class from day one. So Charlie would come and join group times every day. And in fact, Charlie was often used to inform the children of my expectations during group time. And I'd also use Charlie as the stimulus for group conversations, similar to story prompted conversations, but specific to our classroom. So for example, I would say, oh, Charlie mentioned to me last night that she had nobody to play with. And then we would discuss some of the strategies that the children in the class might use to help her find somebody to play with. So these life-size puppets or dolls are called persona dolls, and there's plenty of information on the net about them, about how to use them in the classrooms, actually. Now, two other strategies which is showing emerging research is the turtle technique and also social stories. Now, these strategies have been around for some time, but typically used in children with autism, who've been diagnosed with autism. So social stories are short, simple stories written from the perspective of the child that provides explicit instruction on desired social behaviours. So the story should be descriptive, meaningful, and should be kept positive to focus on the desired action. So basically your goal is to teach the child the desired behaviour. So social stories can be easily made using photos of an individual child moving through the steps, along with some simple text which targets the social behaviour that they require support with. So, for example, teaching a child to ask and then wait for a turn at something that they like to do. There is an example of a social story on some of the resources that Hannah will provide a link to at the end of the session. So the turtle technique provides children with really explicit steps to calm down when they feel big emotions. So children are explicitly taught the 4 steps of the technique, and the first step involves the child stopping the behaviour or the interaction, and they go into their turtle shell. So, and they might do this by crouching down or curling into a ball. They take some deep breaths until they feel calm, and then when they're calm, the child with support thinks of some possible solutions to try. So I have actually used this strategy really successfully with the child a long time ago, actually, who used to become very frustrated and very angry when things didn't go his way. So how I used it was I had a giant turtle puppet, and in negotiation with him, spoke to him, and it was just one-on-one teaching him the turtle technique. Spoke to him about where the puppet was going to be located, and when he was starting to have those physical cues that he's about to lose it, he took himself off to the turtle area and just calmed down. And within the turtle area, I had visual prompts of potential solutions to possible problems. This strategy worked really well. In fact, when he moved out of my prep class into grade 1, the teachers in grade 1 ended up asking for that strategy. So it was consistent for him going into the next classroom. I think the important thing there is that it was negotiated with the child, and it really helped him in that particular situation to feel calm. Okay, so it's time to share your setting the scene strategies. As Sally said, it's time. Sorry, we know you've had probably a long day working, but if you go to the 3rd Padlet, we know that you are all experts and have strategies up your sleeve, but really have the opportunity to share your gems. So we'd really like you to share some of your favourite strategies that you believe help to set the scene to prevent behaviours that challenge. Brain breaks, love it. Developing emotional language. I think that really helps for children to be able to put a label on how they're feeling, and that will guide your response as well. Spending time outdoors. Making sure you spend time with each child. I think the confident and calm educators really speaks back to, the positive relationships, but also the consistency of, stable emotional environments as well. Visuals for calm choices, which really feeds into the social stories. clear routine. And I think that clear routine, I mean, although it can and should be flexible, it also helps children feel secure and to know what's coming next. Okay, I might keep moving. So we'll now move to in the moment. So these are the strategies: directing and redirecting, praising and rewarding, and resolving. And these strategies are typically used when challenging behaviours occur. So directing and redirecting. So educators often find themselves in situations where they need to direct and redirect children's behaviour. So when we talk about directing, we're referring to guiding children towards a desired action or behaviour, whereas redirecting is guiding children away from an undesired action or behaviour. And educators can do this using verbal and non-verbal communication strategies. So in relation to verbal directions, research has identified that there are more effective and less effective ways of giving verbal directions. So effective verbal directions involve instructing and specifying specifically the action you want completed. So for example, please keep your hands to yourself. Effective verbal directions also involve do commands instead of don't commands. So tell the children what you want them to do rather than what you don't want them to do. So saying we walk inside instead of don't run will be much more effective than providing loose instructions such as put the things away or put the blocks over there rather than put the blocks into the block basket. And also rather than phrasing the instruction as a question when children really don't have a choice. So for example, would you like to tidy up now? What's going to happen is children would tend to say, no, they don't want to tidy up. So you've instantly got some conflict about to happen. Non-verbal prompts can also be really helpful to guide children towards a desired behaviour without interrupting what's going on. So these non-verbal directions can just be a thumbs up to basically indicate that what the child's doing is something that is really helping the situation in the class, or they're taking turns, they're waiting for a turn to speak, just giving a thumbs up or a smile or even a nod of the head as if to say, I can see you and you're really trying. One strategy that I found particularly useful when a child had difficulty waiting for a turn in group time was that when he would start to interrupt, I would crouch down and be at his level and just hold his hand until the person who was talking is finished, so usually another child. When the child had finished talking and it was this particular child's turn to talk, I would always say, thanks for waiting until such and such had finished. Now it's your turn. What did you want to say? So that's sort of just reinforcing that by holding his hand, it was reinforcing that I'm really interested in what he's saying. But someone else was talking at the moment, and then thanking him basically reinforces or offers that, explicit directive that, thanks for waiting. Of interest, we educators think, and so often I used to say in my practices, stop and look at me to make sure that a child was stopping and looking to indicate that they were listening before we issue directions. Interestingly, the studies that have investigated this have concluded that it's not necessary to have the child do both things, both stop and look. One or the other is fine as long as the child has indicated they are listening in some way, bearing in mind, obviously, that children will show they are listening in different ways also. Praise and rewards were the next strategy for responding to behaviours in the moment. So there were two types of praise identified, two types of praise that were specifically focused on challenging behaviours. So there were general statements that indicate approval of behaviour, but do not specify the specific behaviour. For example, great work or awesome, you're doing really well, and specific praise. And specific praise indicates approval of specific behaviour. So the behaviour that is approved is named under specific. So thanks for putting the books away. That helps to look after them so that they don't get stepped on and ripped. So the research identifies that specific praise rather than general praise is more effective in reinforcing desired behaviours and discouraging negative behaviours. So rewards are always quite a contentious issue in early childhood services, which is quite interesting because the research also offers mixed results and mixed views on rewards. So the findings of the review show that material or activity-based rewards were not effective for all children and in fact may increase negative behaviours in some children. So supporting children to resolve challenges or conflicts rather than solving the problems for them, provide them with opportunities to learn really valuable skills. The research has also told us that children are less likely to adopt educator-suggested or dictated solutions and are more likely to adopt a solution when they are involved in finding the solutions. So it's really important that we play a role in helping children to identify and respond to their own emotions and to give them strategies to have some agency about responding to their physical cues. So there were quite a number of strategies that can help resolve challenging behaviours. So here you can see educators can mirror a child's feeling. You know, for example, you might look at a child with empathy when something's happening. You might label their emotions. I can see you're really feeling really frustrated. You might validate their emotions. I can see why that might make you sad. You can discuss, I wonder what it is that's making you sad. You might provide an alternative view, and you can remind children of expectations as well as supporting their problem-solving skills. Again, I'm drawing on my own classroom experience, but I had an A3 scrapbook that we used to have as our brainstorming scrapbook. And when a problem occurred, I would sit down with the child or group of children to brainstorm potential solutions to problems. And so I'd scribe their ideas, and I'd typically in brackets put their name beside their ideas only to show them that their idea is important. Then we would look at the list and decide which strategy we were going to try first. So I used this strategy particularly for a child who had really significant separation anxiety from his mum, and it ended up becoming an issue because I was taken away from the group for a fairly long period of time while he was upset. So while I supported him emotionally, I actually decided to consult him about, what was going on for him. So outside the moment of emotion, I sat down with him and I explained to him that his mum had decided that he needed to come to prep. But just because he needed to come to prep, I also wanted him to feel happy about coming to prep. So I asked him if there was anything that we could do to help him. And we listed a few things in the A3 book where he said, we could hang a photo. Actually, I suggested he could hang a photo of his mum in his pocket, in his locker, sorry. I also asked him about what he liked to do at home with his family to see if there was something that we could incorporate from his home life. And we ended up coming to the idea that he loved watering their veggie garden at home. So it's something that he and his mother and father, who also travelled a lot, did together. So at the time at school, we had a dirt patch, but not a planted out veggie garden. So I asked him if he would like to help create one. So he agreed. And what ended up happening was we had this wonderful learning experience that developed from it. So basically we wrote a list together of the vegetables that he wanted to plant in the garden. His mum ended up taking him to the shops to purchase the seedlings. We then planted the seedlings, and once the garden was planted, every morning when Miles, and that's a pseudonym, he would, every morning when he came, he would happily say goodbye to his mum while he watered the garden. So this approach only evolved because I discussed the challenge with him. So some of you may also be wondering, well, what about punishments? So there's currently no evidence that punitive reprimands, for example, that's naughty, or punishments are effective strategies to respond to challenging behaviours. In fact, the use of reprimands and punishments are associated with more severe behaviours and not consistent with the national quality standards. So importantly, responding to children's cues and your knowledge of them will guide you in your strategy selection. And these will be based on individual children and also the circumstances involved. So we'll now move to resetting the scene. These strategies are particularly helpful when a challenging behaviour is reoccurring. So the strategies of revising, and reflecting inform future actions that can serve to reduce or prevent this behaviour from continuing or reoccurring. And revisiting involves both the educator and child, whereas reflecting involves an educator, a room team, a family team, and or the staff team. So sometimes having extended conversations with the child about challenging behaviours when they occur is not feasible or reasonable. And that's typically because their emotions are fairly high. So it's important to wait until it's calm. So the evidence shows that having conversations outside the moment can support children's pro-social and positive behaviours and can shape future actions. So it's, as I said before, it's important that these conversations take place when the child and yourself are calm and settled. So it's important that you use the conversation to hear the child's perspective. Today I noticed that you yelled at Tess. You looked really angry. What was going on? It's use the conversation to discuss the impacts of the behaviour, such as, snatching toys makes Ellie really sad. What was happening? You can discuss how their behaviour may not lead to their desired outcome if you know what their desired outcome was or their intention was. And together with the child or the group of children or the whole group, you can brainstorm potential solutions and strategies for the future. So I mentioned using the A3 scrapbook before, and I've given you an example. I'll give you another example where the children were actually waiting for a turn at the swing, actually wanted a turn at the swing. And so what we did do was we sat down together, just the small group of children who all wanted a turn, and we brainstormed as many solutions as we possibly could and wrote these solutions down. We would choose a solution, and sometimes this was done through consensus or voting. And if the selected idea was tried and didn't work, we would then go back to the list to decide on what we're going to try next. So this strategy showed that the first solution may not always work, and it really demonstrates those habits of mind of being persistent, and that we should keep trying until we find a solution that does. So here's an example of the swing. So the problem was a few children wanted a turn on the swing. Children suggested a range of ideas, and the ideas were listed. Ask for a turn, sing Incy Wincy Spider, and then we swap, use a timer, wait for a turn, or do something else until Peter's finished, and then he comes to get me. So while I acknowledge that this process does take a long time, but what I have found is children start to adopt the problem-solving skills naturally into their play. So while it takes a long time at the start, short-term pain for long-term gain, I guess is how I would describe it. It really helps to empower children with those knowledge and skills about potential solutions. Okay, so the final strategy that we'll discuss is the importance of educator reflections on behaviour. And this is particularly relevant for challenging behaviours that reoccur. So reflection can offer insights into why a challenging behaviour has occurred and offers opportunities to identify potential strategies that might be tried in the future. So first of all, Knowledge about the child and the context is key. This knowledge relates to understanding the child's personality, the preferences and sensitivities, the environment surrounding the child, including considering the expectations, the setting, and family circumstances, and also the group dynamics, including personalities of peers and educators in the group. So there are so many different reasons for behaviours that challenge. And to bring this home, I'm now going to show you a 30-second snippet, which is taken from a 2.5-minute student dramatisation of a poem written by Sarah Dillon. The poem is titled "I Am Rude." And the term rude is used to describe behaviours that may be seen as rude, including challenging behaviours or antisocial behaviours. So I'll play the clip now.
I am rude because I'm tired, hungry, thirsty, or just want to cuddle, but don't realise I'm feeling these things.
I am rude because I've got heightened levels of cortisol in my body, which pushes me into fight, flight, or freeze.
I am rude because you've done something nice with me or for me, and I want to remind you that I'm a bad kid.
So the full dramatisation is on YouTube and is incredibly powerful. So you might like to use it in a staff meeting to prompt reflection on how challenging behaviours are viewed and responded to. And I think it's really important to reflect on what is the challenging behaviour trying to communicate to us.
I am rude because I'm...
Okay, so in summary, and we're going to talk about key takeaways. So we've spoken about strategies that educators can select from to respond to low and mid-level challenging behaviours in ECSE classrooms. So the framework that we've put up on the screen is developed by from the review, which really summarises the key strategies that can help you plan for, respond to, and prevent reoccurrences of challenging behaviours. We were going to do a reflective activity, but I'll just give you that tonight because we're running out of time. And it might be something that, you can use the questions, and I'll explain it shortly, but you can use the questions in a staff meeting to identify one challenging behaviour that you'd like to work on. So the key takeaways from tonight, the strategies discussed are not formulae for practice. They should be used to inform your decision making in combination with your knowledge about the challenging behaviour, about the context in which the behaviour is occurring, and your knowledge of individual children, noting that all of the strategies that we've mentioned tonight are not applicable to all challenging behaviours, and all of the strategies may also not suit all children. So that's where it's really hard to have that blanket rule, and it's important that you use your professional advice. So the reflective activity, and I think we could possibly share this, is I just want you to, and I'll just mention the questions, think about a behaviour that challenges, and these are potential reflective questions that you might be able to use to inform next steps. So I would suggest maybe during a staff meeting or even at home, you think of the behaviour and you can jot down potential answers to those questions, and it might actually help you take it direct where you go next. And I will hand over to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Sandy. It's been a pleasure listening to you and also hearing some really specific examples from your own practice as well. I think it just really helps to drive the point home and to kind of think about what it looks like within those settings. I'm very conscious that we've covered a lot in quite a short amount of time this afternoon, but all of the resources that we have available today are available on our E4L website. I will paste a link in the chat for you right now so you know exactly where to go to access them. This webinar is also being recorded. We will also be sharing the recording of the webinar and slides with you, so rest assured it will all be coming your way in probably a week or so. Before we start wrapping up, we've got about 5 minutes left, and we had quite a few questions come in when you submitted your registrations. If you have any burning questions, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A now, but I don't know that we're going to get time to have a look at them. But I think it would be interesting from our perspective to see what's really live for you at the moment, and we can think about ways that we might be able to engage with these questions moving forward. But one of the key questions that came up in the registrations was, how do you work with parents when their child is displaying behaviours that challenge, and perhaps they might not be ready to believe that their child is displaying challenging behaviours? So I guess, Sandy, a question for you around that.
Thanks, Hannah. And it is always a very tricky question. And while I can't speak from an evidence perspective on talking with parents, I do understand how challenging it can be to have these really challenging conversations. So my advice, and this is purely based on my experience, my advice would really be to prioritise creating and connecting, creating relationships with parents very early on. Don't wait until you think there might be a problem before discussing what the children are doing, what they like to do, what they do at home, just to really establish that this is a team, you're working together as a team. So in the past, when I have had to have conversations with parents about challenging behaviours, I haven't come at it from the perspective that the child is to blame. But what I have done is come at it from a perspective that I need some help to support the behaviour in the classroom. And I first use the conversation to draw on parents' expert knowledge of their child and to ask them for the strategies that they may use at home, particularly if they also experience the challenging behaviour at home. Once they've told me the strategies or potential strategies, if it aligns with the NQS, I will try that strategy and continue to maintain that open communications with parent and families. For families, this is often also the time where this is the first group experience outside the family. So this might be the first time that they are displaying some challenging behaviours. So this can be quite confronting for families and for parents. And it might take a lot more than once to actually, for them to become aware or accepting that there could potentially be a problem. So Sally, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think you've covered it there, Sandy, but I think, yeah, just remembering that particularly when we're talking about problems that may lead to things like diagnosis for children later down the track, these are processes for parents. And so it might feel frustrating initially when you try and communicate an issue to a parent and they don't seem to hear you. But remember, that doesn't always mean that they're not prepared to listen. It just might be that they're not ready to listen because they can't quite process it yet. So for these particular, when we're facing issues where we might see that our child might have long-term, problems that may influence them throughout their schooling, these are sometimes things that are going to take parents some time to get their head around. So I guess it's just always having that empathy at the back of your mind as well, and the patience around it too. But of course, going back to the strategies Sandy's talking about of working hopefully collectively with the parent to come up with some sort of joint solution.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Sally, for answering that one. I think that's a really important reminder for all of us around that level of patience and that connection between home and the child experiencing in the room and at home, and kind of having that connection there. I'm very conscious that we have 2 minutes to go, and I'd like to get you all out of here on time. To finish up, we'd really love to hear from you. I've dropped a well, you can see on the screen there's a QR code. If you'd like to scan that, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, there should be a link in the chat. I've sent it to everyone this time, that you should be able to access to complete a pretty short survey. It's for us to find out a little bit about you, but also for you to tell us about what has worked well in today's webinar and what you might like to see differently next time. We take all of your feedback on board really seriously. So if you have a few minutes, I'd really encourage you to complete that now. I promise you it's short and very easy to answer. And while you're doing that, on the next slide, you can see that here are our contact details. If you have any questions, if there is anything that you would like to follow up on, please feel free to keep in touch. You can see all of the channels that Evidence for Learning are on, but if you haven't already subscribed to our e-newsletter, I'd strongly encourage you to do that. And I can say that next week we have something coming out that may be of interest for you, which is on early mathematics, and that looks at maths practices across both early learning settings as well as very lower primary school. So might be a bit of an incentive to sign up if you're not already. Look, I will finish us up because we're at 6 p.m. here, but it might vary depending on where you are across the country. Thank you all so much for coming this evening and for participating. It's been a real joy to see your responses come through on the Padlet boards and also using the Q&A functions. I can see how engaged you have been in this session. I'd especially like to thank Sandy and Sally for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us. And I really hope that everyone has at least one thing that they can take away from this evening. So whether that be a strategy that you might like to try, or whether it be a new piece of information that you just want to go and consider a little bit more and kind of sit with. As I said earlier, the slides will be available and a copy of the webinar recording in about a week or so, and you'll be emailed that, and you can kind of go from there to take it all back in. Thank you again for joining us. It's been a pleasure to be with you.